So, I want to talk to you about a bit more of a complex topic today. It's the idea of spirit and form, which ties together a conception of historical materialism with a deeper, more kind of metaphysical understanding of the evolution of the spirit through time. So, there's two ideas that I would say historically have not yet really been reconciled, which is the concept of Hegel's spirit, the evolution of spirit through time, and the grounding of spirit in historical materialism through form, which would be the realm of Marx or Walter Benjamin or Lukács. Um, this is the idea, really, that I think we struggle with as a human species to understand what is the innate sort of spiritual teleology of time, right? How does spirit move through time? Um, and how does spirit become enlightened through time and thus manifest materially in different form? And to me, Satchel Paige, I mean, my favorite player of all time, I think one of the most epic and mythic baseball players of all time. He's the sort of Odysseus of baseball, as I would put him in terms of exile and return, right? Where he is forced by the nature of the spirit of his time to travel to great lengths, and as such, he has this multiplicity of journeys, especially south of the border of the United States, as well as within the United States with barnstorming teams, the major leagues, and as you see in this broadside from 1962, returning to the Negro Leagues as they became increasingly barnstorming based. It was a remembrance of Black culture, this continuance of the Negro Leagues, Negro American League Baseball, where Satchel Paige was playing with Goose Tatum and the Harlem Stars. He actually returned to play against the Kansas City Monarchs, his former team with which he had great exploits. You have this structure which Satchel Paige witnesses in his exile and return, which is a complexifying of history, a dialectic of progress, so to speak, where you see the spirit of the time and the spirit of the age in America changes, even just during Satchel Paige's career. We'll say from 1920, when the Negro Leagues began, all the way up into the late 60s and 70s, where, as we well know, the civil rights movement comes into full fruition, as well as new forms of political and student-based activism against the Vietnam War, women's rights, rights for Black Americans, right? These fermenting revolutionary structures which emerge post-World War II and have a deep connection with the integration of Major League Baseball, which we well know Jackie Robinson and Satchel Paige both played very, very important and essential parts in. What we must witness in terms of this is an evolution of a collective consciousness, a arising in awareness through which phenomenologically certain forms appear and reappear, but they reappear in a complexification. So I have several different photographs in my archive which document Satchel Paige's quote-unquote last ride, so to speak, in the mid-'60s with the Kansas City Athletics, where he returns to Major League Baseball for one last appearance. And you can see here this 1962 broadside where he returns to the Negro Leagues for a series of last appearances. And then, of course, is inducted into the Major League Hall of Fame in the early 1970s. Satchel Paige himself, as an archetype of the journeyer or the wanderer, as a figure in baseball, as well as the mythic figure of Odysseus, suggests that what he experiences through his career is a complexification of Black identity in terms of inclusion and exclusion in American institutions and the creation of the subculture. And I won't even call it a subculture necessarily. I'll call it a independent culture of Black baseball, and the complexification of the dynamic of the relationship between Black baseball and the institutionalized, segregated, quote unquote, white baseball of the early, mid, and even late 1900s. what Satchel Paige experiences, and a large part of what I believe he represents in the great history of baseball, is a figure of profound giftedness, skill, and talent for storytelling. He represents a sort of griot or bardic figure in American baseball history. And through his talent, just through the sheer witness and will of his skill, right? He has these events where he'll pull the entire field, all of the fielding players off the team, and faces each batter individually, or he'll face Josh Gibson individually and strike him out, right? This total mastery of the sport of baseball. He himself, in many ways, becomes a singular figure that transcends the spirit of the age and actually propels it forward, much in the way that Jackie Robinson does this when he integrates baseball. The sheer force of will of his character and his determination to succeed, not only for himself but for others. Remember, Jackie Robinson says the impact and importance of a life is how it impacts others, right? It's a profound ethics, a profound spiritual ethics. We witness these figures who appear in history, who are manifestations of this gale force wind of progress, that themselves propel forward and avail us of a time of deepening and greater complexity. And these figures themselves are forces of spirit, right? They're forces of this essential spiritual will towards progress. And Benjamin has a great quote regarding the angel of history, who looks back into the ruins even as it presses forward with this gale force wind that we call progress, which is the nature. He's remarking on the nature of Hegelian time, which is the evolution of consciousness through space-time. And so we see these manifestations of progressive complexity and deepening of meaning, right? This archetypal deepening of meaning. When you see Satchel Paige return to the Negro Leagues in the early 1960s after he's helped integrate Major League Baseball, he's returning to the foundations of black baseball, black barnstorming and grassroots baseball. But he's returning differently. You can see here he's wearing his Monarchs uniform. It's an old halftone photograph that's been inserted into the design of this poster. And it's very clearly elucidated. Satchel Paige, the ageless wonder, reputedly one of the greatest pitchers of all time, or reputedly the greatest pitcher of all time. Paige himself has a career that extends far late into his life, and as such, he experiences this breadth of transformation, and himself is a critical and crucial turning point of this transformation. I'm going to grab some coffee 1 second. And as we witness this unfolding with Satchel Paige, we're witnessing the transformation of the spirit of the age through an individual who, in his process and existence and what he represents and brings as a manifest skill and talent to the game of baseball, he himself is a remarkable force of will who is an essential part of this gale wind of progress. And as such, we see him represented multiple times in different ways. First as the Negro League star, right? And in his exploits south of the United States border on various different teams, in whether it's a cabinet photo or a studio photograph. We see him again represented in magazines in the 1930s and 1940s in the United States of America, many of which are cut out and pasted upon walls of fans or lovers of baseball. Then we see in the late 1940s, he becomes an institutionalized figure. There are photographs of him released in the picture packs for the Cleveland Indians. He receives a number of baseball card releases, right, which are, again, institutionalized symbolic images that represent the game of baseball. And then, again, later in his life, we see him become integrated into this larger media institution of Major League Baseball in terms of wire photographs, type 1 photographs by noted photographers. The press releases for him increase because he's been institutionalized in a media sense, right? He's been entered into these kind of hollowed gates of the professional baseball institution of the United States. And the interesting thing about this broadside here is it shows him still deeply entwined with the black baseball grassroots of his origins as a professional baseball player, particularly with the Kansas City Monarchs. This relationship is complexified over time because even as he becomes an institutional or institutionalized figure within black baseball, he remains within this deepening legacy, right? So it's a very powerful image because it shows even post this cultural integration that Paige still remains deeply entwined with black baseball and black grassroots baseball, even as the kind of collapsing of the two parallel lines of each of these institutions is occurring and has been occurring for the past 10 years. So what we're talking about there with consciousness, phenomenology, and history is that you have the forces that are not yet integrated into the historical and psychological consciousness of the collective. And you have this process of integration that occurs that is propelled forward by certain forces, entities, and phenomena in history which serve as contrast. So the contrast of Josh Gibson, Jackie Robinson, and Satchel Paige playing for the Homestead Grays or the Kansas City Monarchs, and the contrast of the 1939 or 1930s East-West All-Star games for the Negro Leagues, sometimes often outdrawing the Major League professional All-Star games. The inevitability that comes from World War II and the statements made after by the commissioner of Major League Baseball that if black men can fight side by side along white men in this conflict of World War II, they certainly can play on the same field together in Major League Baseball. You see this necessary complexification of history through phenomena, which itself is a revelation of the quality of spirit as a force of unity. So this is kind of the hidden key that connects Hegel with Benjamin, Marx, and Lukács, who are more often considered historical materialist philosophers, historians, and even economists, because what Hegel is telling us and showing us is that the force of history is far more profound than just what it appears to be. It's rather a necessary phenomena itself in a grand cosmological sense of the reunification of seemingly separate objects, which are themselves spirit embodied in form as soul. So what I mean by that is that spirit embodied in form as soul is the vertical well of spirit, where spirit becomes incarnated into form, and it transforms and transmutes through a rising of the ladder of the genetic structure and architecture of the organism to create a deepening of understanding that that organism or that historical material phenomena itself is not at all separate from the unfolding of the universe proper, as a complexification, right, as a compounding of information. And this itself is most clearly represented in genes and genetics. As an evolutionary unfolding through time, as a ladder of information. So when you look at this just purely on a scientific level, I think it makes much more sense, but it's difficult to translate into historical materialism and phenomenology, because you look at the course of human history and maybe your first instinct or impulse would be to say, history doesn't make any sense. It's not logical. It's not linear, right? Doesn't have any meaning behind it. It's just this chaos of evolution and change, and nothing's happening or nothing's changing. But when you look at history, even from a microscopic level, in terms of Paige and Paige's history in the span of maybe 40, 45 years of Major League Baseball and Negro Leagues baseball, you can see just in the span of his lifetime what the force of his will, his skill, and his ability does, even just through that individual, as an aperture which shifts the lens. 1970s, he's inducted into Baseball Hall of Fame as one of the earliest black baseball players to be inducted. You see this witnessing of the historical and political consciousness of the collective, which integrates Satchel Paige both literally and metaphorically into its psychic architecture. Satchel Paige himself becomes known as, I would say, arguably the greatest pitcher of all time, both by exploit and both by myth. Um, and in this process, he's almost ahead of history. Satchel Paige himself is almost a vanguard moment in history and the historical consciousness because he's a revelation of the spirit almost before its time. Um, it was often suggested that he should be the first person to integrate Major League Baseball. So when we're looking at this phenomenological unfolding of history and time, it's kind of easy in a way that if we're not examining it or we're not doing a profound inquiry into it, we can say that it just doesn't make any sense and there is no progress that's occurring. But when we look at real historical movements, and I think, again, black baseball and the intersection with Major League Baseball and integration through the lens of Satchel Paige is such a profound way to look at this, is that you're witnessing, even just in terms of the consciousness of Satchel Paige himself as an entity and a baseball player, you're witnessing a shift in inclusion and exclusion at a psychic level. And here we're just kind of looking at it culturally, like who is included and who is excluded in terms of in and out groups. But at a deeper level, we're looking at what is included in the psychic architecture of how we conceive of ourselves as a species or a cosmological phenomenon. So you're witnessing in this way a metabolism through history, which is an expansion of the consciousness of the organism or of history of humanity or of the cosmos, in the same way that you look at the genetic architecture of a human being becoming complexified with the advent and inclusion of the forebrain hundreds of thousands of years ago. You're looking at that process, which is occurring at a kind of meta macrocosmic level in terms of the evolution of the literal form or the phenomenological appearance of the organism itself proper. But you're looking at that translated through the seeming movement of events and phenomena and processes that occur historically, such as wars or baseball history, or the creation and dissolution of nations and empires and cultures and narratives and stories and religions. These are all ways that the cognitive architecture of humanity itself is becoming radically complexified and is resolving itself through complexity as a process of digestion or metaphorical consumption of archetypes, symbols, phenomena, images, which itself is a process of the developing or organizing psyche of the collective organism or the universe itself, processing perceived difference as separation and incorporating that into a profound transcendental unity of consciousness. And this is kind of what Hegel suggests as the approaching singularity or the absolute as it occurs as a sort of end of history or end of time. And it's important to not interpret this quote unquote incorrectly or read this wrong, because that itself is an apocalyptic event, as in a sort of essential enlightenment to the foundations of history, the essence of history, which itself is spirit changing form and transforming fundamentally through psyche, through the architecture of psyche, through the architecture of revelation and consciousness itself of phenomena, through phenomena and with phenomena. The phenomena is a body, it is a form, and that form is a metabolizing force that is essential to the architecture of the universe itself, in the same way that we're talking about the metabolism of the body as it relates to the thermonuclear structure of stars. These are the same energetic principles occurring at scales, which are including, incorporating, and consuming energy as a part of a larger metastructural process of existence itself. And through that incorporation and consumption of energy, the form itself changes. The phenomena itself changes, as you can clearly see with food and water in the body, just the same as the way that the literal architecture of the sun and the earth shift through time. This is all observable phenomena which science utilizes regularly. So again, right, when we go back to the Satchel Paige broadside and historical material phenomena, right, this is connecting history with the essential nature of the spirit of time. you're looking at this radically complexifying architecture of symbols, signs, and archetypes through which Satchel Paige evolves as a individual, historical, political, and cultural phenomenon. He is observed here as clearly the ageless wonder, the greatest pitcher of all time. He's wearing a monarch's uniform, and he's returning to the site of his origins to participate in black grassroots baseball even after integration has occurred. This is a really profound movement which shows this kind of spiral architecture of the stairs or the ladder of history through which these perennial archetypes recur, such as exile and return. Satchel Paige returns to these origins of separation through and after and in unity to represent a profound complexification of what it means to participate in black baseball and why black baseball exists as a cultural phenomenon and continues to exist. And what it means for Satchel Paige to be an essential figure in that process, not only championing it, right, and being one of the primary and primordial archetypes of it, but also in his ability and force through black baseball as a grassroots movement to make possible for integration, right? The rising of historical consciousness of Satchel Paige across all of baseball itself is one of the primary drivers of integration in baseball history. You have scouts looking at Joe DiMaggio as he's coming up, and he goes 1 for 4 against Satchel Paige, and they say, "Oh, DiMaggio goes 1 for 4 against Paige, right? He's a good hitter. It's just kind of he's standing against that standard of Paige's greatness and his excellence." And this is clear, right? This becomes increasingly historically clear, and it's an undeniable force. This is incredibly powerful when you think about baseball history and the force of Satchel Paige himself, because it shows that history is moved forward by these heroic achievements, which is why I suggest Satchel Paige as Odysseus. The heroic achievement of Paige himself through baseball is a rising in consciousness, which not only impacts the culture of baseball and the cultural history of baseball, but it actually impacts the cultural and political consciousness of America itself. And by consequence, just by the literal network and nature of consciousness, it's not bound or delineated by borders. It seeps through everything. It's a historical, eternal force that it transcends all attempts to box it in or force it to exist in certain parameters, as we can see through evolution, right? Historical forms change through time in terms of just even the evolution of species, as Darwin puts it. His force of will, right? It's something that actually changes the consciousness of history and reroutes how history unfolds. So this is incredibly powerful, right? And there's a deep sense of agency in consciousness in terms of the way that behavior functions and the way that we act, right? There's a ethics of consciousness wherein we're moving towards integration already as a historical and universal principle, and as such, our behavior towards integration is essential, and that we align with that underlying universal teleological force toward that absolute, right? Toward that singularity of spirit revealing and having revelation of itself in history and in time through form, right? This is kind of the essential metaphysics of Christ, and the appearance of Christ in time or in history or in space is to suggest that, right, the Son of God appears in the world. This is exactly what Hegel's talking about. It's the singularity which unifies spirit and form, right? Which unifies the eternal architecture of consciousness with the immediate presence of phenomena. And this is the work that Satchel Paige is doing, right? Knowingly or unknowingly. Same with Jackie Robinson, right? Is that through the cultural form of baseball as play, it becomes a field of revelation for the history of the spirit, just as much as the play of all of human history, the play of war, or as Shakespeare says, what all of the world is a stage, right? And all of the men and women are players on that stage, right? This is what is suggested, profound, right? Because of course Shakespeare is before Hegel, where he's saying that the world history, or all that is phenomenologically, is a theater but he doesn't necessarily state why or a theater for what. But it's a theater for the evolution of consciousness, right? That world history is a phenomenological unfolding, all of which is just a dialectic of relationship, which Einstein later states with his theory of relativity, right? Bodies in space are almost constituted by the way that they relate in space and in time. And the way that they relate is through scientific force, right? The way that they relate is through physical force. Which is the gravitational fields and the literal architecture of their bodies in space and in time. And that changes over time, again, right? Whether that's asteroids, whether that's planetary formations, whether that's star systems, that's a system in flux, and which means the thermodynamics of that system are rapidly changing and shifting because the way that energy flows through them is complexifying. And again, those systems aren't closed, which means things and phenomena and energy enter into them and exit from them in a way that is compounded and predicted by the massive architecture of the universe proper, right? There's systems within systems within systems. So in this way, when we look at history, history itself is the sort of mirror of consciousness and the mirror of evolution, because we look at the phenomena that emerge through it and how sort of symphonic movements of history begin and are resolved, such as the creation of Negro League baseball from black barnstorming, and even from earlier, the way that black baseball players baseball was already integrated in the late 1800s to a degree, right, to a very minor degree. But there was then an official ban on black baseball players in quote unquote American professional baseball. And then you have this dialectical movement and relationship between the segregated white professional league and then the rapidly burgeoning black professional league, right? And the inevitable resolution of these two archetypal forms, which is pressed on and forward by figures like Josh Gibson, Satchel Paige, the East-West All-Star Game, Jackie Robinson, right? Jose Mendez from Cuba. You have these movements which are a unity separation construct, again, as why I state exile and return as an archetypal phenomena. But in this unity separation in the same way that we look at kind of larger planetary cycles, the movement of planets propelled by the movement of our star, right, the sun, through the universal architecture, right, through the galactic architecture toward the galactic center. The same way that you have that essential planetary movement of cyclical evolution or revolution, it's not standing still in space and in time. It's a spiral form, and that spiral form is a complexifying of the unity and separation as a form of evolution, a teleological dialectical evolution of phenomena of soul and form as it expands and contracts, but becomes complexified through that dialectical movement in space-time. So it's a complex thing to talk about, but it's very easily seen in Satchel Paige, just specifically through this broadside. He's wearing that Kansas City Monarchs uniform of old, and he's returning, right, again to the site of the Negro Leagues, even as they're disbanding post-integration, right? It's a reification of the theme, the emergent theme, which is unified, right, within the integrative structure of American professional baseball in the late 1940s into the early 1950s. But you can see the complexity through time of who Satchel Paige becomes and what Satchel Paige becomes through the aperture and lens of baseball and culture. And what it means for him to return to the site of the Negro Leagues to barnstorm even post-integration of baseball, where he becomes a quote-unquote Major League Baseball player. These are phenomena which, through the nature of the history of difference and the return to unity, and the history of difference and the return to unity, is consciousness's attempt to reconcile perceived difference into an architecture of unity, into an architecture of conscious unity and conscious soul within form. Again, right, like you have something like the nature of the evolution of Christ as a historical phenomena, and then what happens after Christ in terms of Rome and Christianity. You have these phenomenological material appearances, often through individuals, who transcend or defy the perceived historical bridges of difference. And then what has to happen culturally and collectively and psychologically is that there has to be a metabolism of this this defiance of the previous architecture of the structure of consciousness itself. So when we're talking about the experience of fragmentation, which is something that I would say is native to humanity and human consciousness, just due to the nature of, right, we're born and we look up at the sky and we perceive a separation from God. We're born from the womb of history, and we look up into history and the sky and look backwards into history and perceive this separation from which we are attempting to reconcile that difference, right? To reconcile how history has and can occur, has occurred and can occur, and what has been lost through the rubble and the ruin of history. And at the same time, what we're moving forward towards, we don't understand, right? We don't understand death or the metaphysical architecture or meaning of a black hole. We're existing within this kind of narrow range through which we touch a stove and it's hot, or we perceive the feeling of hunger in our bodies, right? This is a attempt to learn and understand that which is far beyond the architecture of our existing consciousness, right? Far beyond the architecture of our genetic ability and our foresight and our hindsight and the senses and sensations of the human body, which dictate most of the everyday kind of routine and rigmarole and rhythm of life itself. But we perceive the truth of history, right, in terms of the evolution of consciousness, through this increasing understanding, this understanding of, really, it's something like pattern recognition, right? Understanding how history unfolds at a grand scale, and then, of course, within our own lives as a personal principle of the recognition and reconfrontation with the quote-unquote essential monsters of our lives, which are the undigested and disjected psychological principles which we have not yet integrated within ourselves. And this essential fragmentation occurs again at the personal, at the collective, at the ancestral, and at the supra-species cosmic consciousness level as a historical phenomena of the creation of the universe, the separation of the universe into independent bodies, and the attempt to reconcile those independent bodies as a awareness or consciousness of that essential architecture of separation, and as such, the creation and formation of a psychological unity, even within the perceived complexity of the phenomenological unfolding of the universe itself. Again, right, this is what's interesting, is that phenomenologically, it's not so much being called to an absolution or a death of phenomenology. We're actually increasingly expanding and complexifying our awareness in terms of consciousness and the architecture of the universe itself. As it unfolds, even as a thermodynamic principle, the solidification and cooling of the experiential process of the universe itself. We're more so being called to revelate that psychologically. So when we're talking about revelation or apocalypse or psychedelic revealing, we're talking about the psyche experiencing the truth of this profound nature of the unified cosmological wholeness of existence as a aperture of experience, which we are experiencing even through this perceived separation as the organism itself as a sort of microscope or telescope into the mystery of the cosmos, or the mystery of existence. And we see that occurring consistently and constantly through history. And that's what Hegel is calling the spirit, right? The spirit as it's manifest in history itself and human history, because human history is the field of and through which we are exploring that phenomena. Right? So whether it's through technology, whether it's through art, whether it's through baseball, we're looking at all of these different ways, which are apertures and lenses through which we are creating prosthetic webs and networks, such as the internet or telephone wiring, to experience this reality of unity and this reality of wholeness, even at a quantum mechanical level, to experience it through the aperture of the physical, right, which again is grounded in material, or the creation of material, and the process of that revelation through which spirit actually is able to retroactively, through cognition and through awareness, reunite with that psychic quantum mechanical architecture of the universe, and as such actually alter its architecture, right? Participate directly and intimately with the nature of the universe itself, and not be determined by it, right? Pre-directed and predetermined by it, as in the species itself unfolding unconsciously as a natural imperative, the process of a dialectical redoubling, again, as Kierkegaard calls it, to be able to reflect upon the cosmic architecture of the nature of existence itself in terms of genetics, quantum mechanics, Hegel's spirit of history or spirit of time. And then within that process of awareness and understanding the teleology of existence itself, entering into that process and experience consciously, and us ourselves changing the time through the metabolic fabric and framework of consciousness itself, and participating actively in the awareness of that which we know we are, our true identity, in a cosmological, phenomenological, historical sense. It's incredibly powerful, right? And so Satchel Paige is almost like the bardic or the griotic agent of that, just in terms of his the way of in which he speaks, the sort of metaphorical, legendary storytelling essence of the figure of which he constructs himself in history and in time. He's almost Odysseus's nobody in the cave, right, with the Cyclops. He's constructs and reconstructs his identity at will and at force in order to be and as an agent of consciousness. It's incredibly powerful. He's a very spiritually advanced figure in baseball, where he comes from in terms of his roots in the deep American South in the early 1900s, who he becomes as a figure of baseball consciousness that transcends the perceived dualities of the time. As much as they try to cage him in, it's something he refuses. There's this whole discourse around his age, and there's so many things about his life that he tells. They remain unclear, but he tells, and his stories themselves change because he's opened himself up as this figure of revolutionary consciousness that occurs within the architecture of baseball as a cultural form, but ripples out in great magnitudes in terms of the historical, political, and collective consciousness of humanity and existence itself. This essential force is what we're talking about. So Satchel Paige himself as consciousness is a sort of radical transcendental form, or transcending form, which pulls the drag of human history itself in the wind, in the gale force wind of progress, into the future of a deeper unity, right? Even a more complex unity, but a deeper unity nonetheless in its complexity. It breaks the existing forms and bounds, and through that breaking creates a sort of transcendental whole, which itself is a constantly shifting, almost chameleonic presence. So this broadside, I think, is incredibly profound and exemplifies this dialectical tension between the historical material phenomenology of human history and the grand architecture of spirit as a cosmological history of existence itself, and how that grounds itself down and manifests itself in scales through human history as a revolutionary overturning of consciousness, and as such the changing of phenomenology through this inevitable collision course of perceived opposites or constructed differences which exist in a sort of frictive tension as much as tectonic plates in terms of the underground of the earth, which are naturally seeking to achieve resolution even in conflict. And this is the nature of force as it exists in space-time, where masses of bodies are in this perennial dance of unification in perceived wholeness of space-time and opposition and difference, as we discussed with the movement of the planets in the solar system through the galactic architecture of the Milky Way, or the realm in which we live. This is manifest all across scales. So that movement, right, history itself is just the stage, again, as Shakespeare said it, for this phenomenology to unfold this story of perceived separation and difference into a cosmological wholeness of unity as in a singularity, that the true force of history is all movement toward the revelation of the psyche, right? The revelation of the psyche as manifest within all space and all time as really a spiritual process of the revelation of the true nature of that which is, right? This is what all of our science is, our culture, um, all of the foundations of human life are headed towards, inevitably, right? Being just pushed again by the gale force wind of history and time, and even just biological evolution as a unconsciously unfolding process of imperatives of the organism, and underlying those imperatives are again that same essential architecture, which is the metabolism of the cosmos, right? That all spirit must necessarily change form, and in changing form, it actually self-revelates. Even just in the advent of the forebrain again, right? It self-revelates itself, and in the complexifying of the genome, there is increased possibility and capacity for revelation. This is something that's already occurring in the unconscious nature and architecture of existence itself. And this is also why we observe it historically as a phenomenological principle which undergirds all of history towards progress, towards knowledge of the true nature and the architecture of consciousness itself, whether that's through technology, the digital world, whether that's through war, whether that's through culture, such as baseball, right? Again, the integration of baseball and the world history of baseball. Because it's something that as we become conscious of it, we can be participating change agents in it and move ourselves consciously again, right? Through awareness, with an efficiency, a swiftness, and a real directive, right? A real spiritual knowledge toward this unfolding of this process in our lifetimes, right? This is kind of what it means to be a revolutionary human being. But it's also something that's occurring unconsciously, right? And it's unfolding as a sort of native metastructural process of the psyche and the cosmos proper, right? The psyche and the cosmos are unifying. We look up at the sky, we say, oh, we must be separate from God, or that the stories of history are occurring abstractly or mythologically. They're occurring within the stars as a metaphorical construct, an archetype of our separation from this grand spirituality or grand spiritual unfolding of the cosmos. What we are revelating and realizing through history is that we are that process innately. And so we're returning to and retaining the archetypes and the mythological systems which we created in an ancient historical sense to depict this grand genesis and unfolding of the creation of the universe, returning them to the historical material body of human history and consciousness itself, and realizing that the mythological processes that we depicted, right? Sometimes those are just looked at as stories or images now in a modern sense. Realizing that those archetypal mythological images themselves are the process of spirit and history, right? They are the mirror or the metaphor of the phenomenological process of spirit and history, and the utter importance of the evolution of the soul, right, towards the spirit and the unification of that within time, right? That's our enlightenment, especially as it occurs through the experience of the trauma of separation, right? The trauma of wounding or the trauma of violence, which convinces us that we are away from God or apart from this great metaphysical process of the creation and unfolding of Source, the essence of all of existence itself. This is easy to experience historically through war, through abuse, through trauma, again, through the creation of black baseball, as a profoundly segregating and violent force of exclusion, which is experienced politically, socially, and culturally through the Jim Crow era racism and violence that occurs in America. To know that this is what is undergirding us is to create a profoundly new historical possibility. It's a sort of salve that allows us to live within the hyper real or the super real spiritual and psychological unfolding and process of history and of time and of humanity itself, living within this essential kind of spiritual source-based identity, right? This eternal, formless truth within the ephemeral suit of the appearance of form, which again is the phenomenology of history, the phenomenology of spirit. And in doing so, redirect our energies and our consciousness towards the most profound, impactful, and meaningful imperative, which is the truth of our nature, and as such to live more profound and healing lives and meaningful lives. But again, as we see through history, even unconsciously, something like the form of this broadside, from its design to its metaphysical and archetypal meaning of Satchel Paige as the one who is exiled and returns as the Odysseus or the griot of baseball history, even just in his storytelling himself, the Homeric quality of him, um, is itself already a profound manifestation of the spirit and the triumph of progress, right? The triumph of evolution and the unity and wholeness of consciousness through history and through time. We already live within this undergirding, but for us to step deeply and more deeply into it, we ourselves are entering into a profound articulation of a new world, which changes everything in the most beautiful way. Because we become knowing and we become known in this grand and profound architecture of the design of the universe itself, and become truly unified within spirit towards ourselves.